Hey everybody, Questwise here, and this is our continuing journey back to basics in 2020, where we're talking about OSR games, we're talking about retro clones, we're talking about the originals. If you watched the series so far, we've talked about like BX and my love for that sort of type of game, that game in particular. We're going to talk about first edition, second edition. We're going to talk about retro clones. Today we're actually going to talk about a game that doesn't really fit as an OSR retro clone, but I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So throughout the series, we're going to be talking about exploring a bunch of different games. We're going to be exploring some old school fiction that will help you further ideas for sort of OSR type games. We're also going to talk about how that fiction has influenced people like Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson to create the game that they did. We're going to talk about things like Labyrinth Lord. We're going to talk about things like Swords and Wizardry. We're going to talk about things like Iron Falcon. A lot of great different things. But the game I want to talk to you about today, and one that I'm probably going to focus on a little bit because I really love this game. And I'm going to do a couple of videos, probably several, talking about this game and going into depth about why I love this game and why I think it fits into our exploration of the Back to Basics theme. That game is Castles and Crusades by Troll Lord Games. Now, I've done some videos on this before about why I really love this game. This game doesn't really fall into sort of like an old school Renaissance type of a system, but it kind of does. It's not really a retro clone of anything else. It's sort of its own game, but it does, I guess, in perspective of looking at old school OSR games as being sort of the D20. Now we're going to talk about other games and stuff as well too that have fallen outside the D20 realm, more into the D6 realm, maybe the D10 realm, those kind of things. But if we're talking about old school games and we're talking about D20 based system mechanics, I think this falls in very, very well. Now, the reason why I appreciate this and why I always sort of lump this into, I don't want to say lump this into, the reason I associate this with old school stuff is because there are a million different games out there on the market right now. There are some major publishers cranking out some very amazing games. There are some independent publishers cranking out some very amazing games. There are independent people who are just uploading their stuff to a variety of different sources, including DriveThruRpg and the DMs Guild and all those kinds of things. So there is a plethora of stuff out there, depending on your play style and things that you can play. So, for instance, if you're a very, very crunchy, love the kind of crunchy type games, there's something out there for you. For me personally, I prefer the more narratively driven games, but I want an old school sort of rule set. I want a rule set that gives me some structure, but then gives me enough variation that I can sort of branch out from that. I can make decisions based on the narrative at hand. There's not a rule for every single thing that can happen. Those are the kind of games I prefer. But in that as well, I also want some games that give me some cool flavor. I want the rule mechanics to sort of emulate the fiction that it's trying to tell. And to me, Castles and Crusades does that the best way possible. Now, if you want to see some other stuff out there on how this works, how it plays, what the crunchy, what the mechanics are of the system, there's some videos out there. I've done a few. My friend Derek Pierce has just posted one up as well too. Check him out. He talks about how the rule mechanics work for this type of game. The reason I love this game and the reason why I want to explore this in Back to Basics is because this really reminds me of the days when I started second edition and then into college playing first edition and playing even earlier editions than that, BX and BECME. It also kind of harkens back to ideas from third edition. What I love about this book is that this alone, along with the Monsters and Treasure book, can be all that you really need to play. And it's very, very thin. The rules in this are simple to teach, they're simple to learn. In fact, in the introduction of this book, the author talks about that was the goal that they were going with. That a game should be about the story, and the rules shouldn't get in the way. They shouldn't be overburdened with rules. The other great thing about this is that if you want more complexity, it's available to you. The Castle Keeper's Guide gives you a billion different ways to increase the complexity of the game. Not so much the complexity. It adds more options to the game, I guess. Complexity is a bad word because I think it gives more optional fuel to the game by adding things like skills, by adding things that are akin to feats, to adding more grit to your combat actions, that kind of things. More options to give you in the game. I've been running this now for a group of friends here in the local area for a little while. We had a little hiatus over the holidays, but we're back at it now. And I think it's been received very, very well. I really love running this game. It gives me a plethora of options that I can use at a table and very flexible ideas that I can implement based on the narrative of the game. The other thing I really love about this, and the thing I love about sort of old school games, especially like BX and first edition and second edition, is they had I'm a huge history nerd. If you haven't gathered that from my past videos, I'll just tell you now, I am a huge history nerd. And my love of history came from the second edition AD&D Player's Handbook. Because they had those little sidebars that would talk about things like, what is a fighter? Here's an example of, here's Beowulf, here's King Arthur, here's, an example of a wizard, here's Merlin. And it would give you little tantalizing bits about them. And it made me want to go and learn more about history and about mythology and about folklore. And that, coupled with a high school teacher that I had, really pushed me into studying history in college. And so I'm a huge history nerd, and I love that. And I feel like things like Castles and Crusades and early editions of like Dungeons and Dragons drew heavily upon historical things. And I love to be able to take mythology and folklore and history and add them to my game. It gives me a much richer feel to the world. It gives me some research material to dive into that I can twist to my own needs. In fact, the game that I'm running right now for friends, we are using the Codex Germania, which gives us a sort of historical account of Germany and its mythology. And we're using that to fuel our campaign. There are a lot of other codex out there. There's a Codex Classicum, I can't remember, but it's based on like classical Greek mythology and history, and I love that kind of stuff. This is the kind of things that I really enjoy adding to my game, and to me that feels old school because to me that was where I began. Things like second edition and BECME and BX and stuff. Those are the kind of things that I love to focus on in those types of games. I like that this feels gritty. The combats we've run so far in our group have been pretty dangerous. Every class, every character that we have has their own individual strengths and has ways to benefit to the group. But when they're very, and maybe it's just my players, but they're very tactical when it comes to approaching combat. And I think a lot of it is this game. The combat in this can be gritty. And to me, it should be. Fighting somebody should not be an easy task. It is not an easy task in real life. It is something that's very, it comes with a lot of risks involved, and a lot of possible harm that could come your way. So that's what I love about Castles and Crusades. I love that it makes the characters and the players think before they act, before they dive into something. And I appreciate that. To me, that feels old school. And that's my, sort of definition of that, kind of what I'm looking back on as old school. It's my experiences from the past and stuff as well, too. I like the flexibility of Castles and Crusades as well, too. I like the being able to use... It's all attribute based. A little bit of rules mechanics here, but it's attribute based. You can add skills and stuff to that, but it still becomes an attribute test. And I really like that because it makes the attributes like strength and constitution and intelligence and so on and so forth feel important to the game. If I have a high intelligence and it's my primary stat or one of my primary stats, I know that I have a wealth of information at my disposal. On the flip side of that, I like that I can choose which attribute, or I can have the players choose which attribute based on the narrative that they want to use, right? So if somebody wants to do something that's a little bit more, say the combat action where they're attacking with their sword, rather than use strength to attack, which would be normal in a melee attack, they want to try something a little bit more dexterous. They want to try to, weave the sword in and try to hit a weak spot. You can choose to use dexterity in that situation if it fits the narrative. And I like the flexibility of Castles and Crusades for that option. I'm going to do a few more videos focusing on Castles and Crusades and showing you some of those options. I want to show you a few of the codexes. I want to show you some of the other options that you have as far as getting more options and depth to your game and such as well too. But I just wanted to focus today on why this sort of fits into my idea of the back to basics idea in this video series, and how in the future we talk about some of these other games like Iron Falcon and Swords and Wizardry and Labyrinth Lord. And before, we've already done a video on the hero's journey and stuff as well too. But I think that I want to show you that how this compares, and it's not. Again, it's its own system, but it does draw heavily upon influences from the past and stuff as well too. So that's going to be it for today. Castles and Crusades. This is the player's handbook. I'll show you the rest of my collection as the videos kind of roll out, and why I really like them and why I have them and how I use them in my game sessions. If you'd like to get a copy of this, I will put a link down in the notes below as to where you can find a copy. And until next time, I am Questwise, and I am out.